Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Our topic for this webinar is Resilient Solar Retrofits, Adding Storage to Existing PV and Making New Installations Storage Ready. This webinar is a presentation of Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project. And our host for this webinar is Seth Mullendor. Seth is the project director for the Resilient Power Project. We have some excellent guest speakers with us today. Before I pass it over to Seth and to our guest speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode. And you have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using your telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. There's some instructions on your screen for how to do that. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as you type them in, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. We'll save about 15 to 20 minutes for that, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We do have a lot of people registered for this webinar, so we expect a lot of questions. In order to make sure that we get to your question, type it in as you think of it. Don't wait until the end. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous Resilient Power Project webinars on our website at resilient-power.org. And we will also send you a follow-up email within about 24 hours with a link to the webinar recording and the slides. And with that, I will pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Seth Mullendor.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Sam said, we have a great crowd here today, and expect this to be a great presentation. It's a really good topic, the retrofits of resilient solar for existing solar systems. So I want to just give you a quick introduction about who we are, then I'll introduce our speakers, and we'll get moving with the presentation. So Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit. We've been in the clean energy space for about 20 years, working on innovations in finance, technology, and policy to promote clean energy technologies of all different sorts. We are supported completely by foundations. Those foundations are listed here on the page. We also have a sister organization, the Clean Energy States Alliance, that is a membership organization of clean energy fund managers that manage funds within at state level to promote clean energy and renewable projects. As Sam said, I am a project manager with the Resilient Power Project. Sam's next slide, please. Just to introduce you quickly to the Resilient Power Project, it's been in existence for, this is going on its third year now, and it came about in the wake of Hurricane Sandy when there were massive power outages across the Northeast, particularly in New York and New Jersey, and a number of people were left without power for an extended period of time. A lot of those people were in affordable housing, public housing, in areas where they didn't have the resources to find refuge in other places and had to shelter in place when diesel generators failed consistently across the area, not only in housing facilities but also in hospitals and other areas. So we looked to an alternative, cleaner, more reliable solution in the form of clean energy technologies, mostly the combination of solar and energy storage systems, which we'll talk about quite a lot today. So our goal with the project is to increase awareness of resilient power systems, solar and storage systems for resiliency, and to increase investment and deployment. And our focus is primarily on disadvantaged communities, low income and other vulnerable populations. And our work is mainly focused on the affordable housing sector and critical public facilities in disadvantaged communities, so fire stations, police stations, emergency shelters, and things of that like. We also work at the state and federal level, in addition to the local and really the building level, to try to work on supportive policies and programs, incentive programs, to help get these systems funded, financed, and promoted across a broader region. As part of our efforts, we do have a small technical assistance fund that's supported by our foundations that can help support some of the pre-development, the initial technical and financial feasibility of costs to be able to move projects to that next stage when they can begin the development process and seek financing. All of the information that I'm telling you about today, as well as a number of our reports that we put out, these are all available on our website, resilient-power.org. We have a lot of information on here. We have a project map that has projects, resilient power projects across the country, solar and storage that are in development or are currently in operation or planning, as well as some featured projects, some tools for people that are looking to begin a resilient power project, such as an initial checklist, along with a number of resources about how resilient solar and storage works, what are the economic opportunities, what are the technical things you have to think about when starting a project. So from there, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have 3 speakers today. First up is going to be Erica Helson. She's a New York State solar ombudsman with Sustainable CUNY. And her work supports efforts to increase the amount of resilient solar in New York by leading working groups that will reduce the technological, regulatory, and financial barriers to integrating solar PV into emergency and resiliency planning. Prior to joining Sustainable CUNY, Erica provided outreach for NYSERDA's commercial and industrial energy efficiency and incentive programs and worked as a project manager for a solar installer in California. Erica has a BA in political studies from Pitzer College and a MPA in environmental policy from Columbia University. After Erica, Kari Burman from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is going to be speaking. She's a senior engineer with NREL, working with their integrated applications group and engineering and modeling group. She has over 20 years of engineering experience in research and development, focusing the past 9 years in renewable energy. And while at NREL, Kari has been focused on evaluating renewable energy opportunities and energy storage for communities, military installations, with a specific focus on microgrids, small island utilities, and remote off-grid villages. She came to NREL from the University of Colorado, where she earned a Master's of Civil Architectural and Environmental Engineering with a focus on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And before that, she had a bachelor's from the University of Colorado, Denver in electrical engineering. And finally, we'll have Lars Lisell. He is also a New York State solar ombudsman with Sustainable CUNY, although he is currently on temporary assignment with CUNY from the National Renewable Energy Lab. So Lars is from both of the areas that our other presenters are from. He spent most of his career focused on technology to market and focused on bringing technology to market and renewable energy. He is focused primarily on energy efficiency technologies, distributed renewables, and energy storage, and specializes in solving energy problems holistically using energy modeling platforms, renewable production forecasting, and microgrid modeling software. At CUNY, Lars is working on a number of initiatives that remove barriers to distributed generation and energy storage implementation through the New York Solar Smart DG Hub and the New York City Grid Ready projects. With that, I will turn it over to Erica.
Great, thanks, Beth. All right, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what the DG Hub, Distributed Generation Hub is. Then Kari is going to go over a system overview, and Lars will give you some development considerations for retrofitting solar. So just for quick background, again, I want to explain what the NY Solar Smart Distributed Generation Hub is. So this is an initiative led by CUNY in partnership with the National Renewable Energy Lab and Meister Consultants Group. The goal of the DG Hub is a more resilient distributed energy system in New York City with a path for expansion across the state and the country. We're working towards this objective by developing a platform to bring together stakeholders that are involved in this space, in the solar plus storage space. We have 4 working groups and an advisory board with stakeholders that come from a variety of backgrounds. So we work with the New York City Mayor's Office, the local permitting agencies, the building and fire departments on permitting challenges. We also work with our local utilities as well as the solar and storage developers themselves. And these partners work with us to create these strategic pathways to lower soft costs to deploying solar and storage projects. And one example of these projects is the retrofit fact sheet that Kari and Lars will be discussing with you today. And the end goal of all of this work is to remove barriers, lower costs, and increase the deployment of resilient PV systems here in New York City, the state, and across the country. And for further background, similar to the Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, our work also came out of Hurricane Sandy. So CUNY, the City University of New York, we've been working on solar issues for about a decade, but we really just started on our resilient solar work following Hurricane Sandy. So we did some research to see how much solar was there in New York City in the affected areas, and in the box here you can see there were about 280 solar installations in the affected areas, and that's about, at that time in 2012, 50% of New York City's total solar installations. And given the weather conditions at the time, some former solar ombudsman at Sustainable CUNY did some research and found that those systems would have produced about 6,500 kilowatt hours of energy that could have been used each day after the storm. And then just to explain how the solar market has advanced here in New York City, in 2015 we kind of reran the numbers and said how much has solar grown. We went from about 280 solar installations to over 1,500 installations. And then we also found that there were a number of solar inverters, the SMA inverters with the emergency power plug, and the number is cut off here, but it was about 17. And then moving forward into this solar plus storage realm, so that we have more solar that can be used during disasters when the grid is down. We looked at the number of energy storage systems across the state, and that's what you see there on the left, that across New York State there are about 16 battery energy storage projects. In New York City, that narrows down to about 9 battery energy storage projects. And then if you're looking at battery storage plus solar combined projects, there are only about 2. That number is growing, and this number may not reflect everything that has been installed. This is only what has been reported to the U.S. Department of Energy's Global Energy Storage Database. But the point here is that in 2016, today, we have over 2,600 solar installations, so we know that there's a great potential for a retrofit market here in New York City. So that led us to develop this educational resource, retrofitting existing solar energy systems with battery storage so that it can be used during times of disaster, and then how do we prepare new installations to be storage ready. So with that, I'll hand it off to Kari.
Thanks, Erica, and thanks everyone for joining us. This is an exciting topic. I'll just give you an overview of the systems that we look at, mostly the components and some of the configuration of how we tie those into a retrofit system. So looking at some of the components, the main components, of course, the solar array we have, and then we'll look more details at the inverters and batteries. And in the solar array, as everyone knows, it produces DC power, direct current energy, and so you need inverters to transform that energy to AC to put it into the load. We talk about 3 different types of inverters. There are standalone inverters that were like for remote areas and off-grid solar systems, and then we have the grid-tied inverters, or microinverters, that are the one-directional, and those are the ones that Erica was referring to, or the systems are usually tied to grid, they sense the grid, and then they go off when the grid goes down. So these cannot function when the grid is on off-grid mode. And then we talk about dual inverters, which also we have, or they're also called bidirectional or inverter chargers. And these ones we can use to actually convert from, or invert from DC to AC, and they can also be used to convert to AC to DC to charge the batteries. So dual inverters assist with regulation and can be used in islanded and microgrid scenarios. And then there's the batteries we look at also, and that in the first year of this project of the DG Hub, we did a fact sheet and looked at different types of batteries in comparison. We looked at lead acid, lithium ion, and flow batteries. Erica, can you take next slide, please? So just as things that we look for in batteries and choosing batteries, you look at cost, energy density, how many life cycles they have, and when a battery charges and discharges, it can create heat, and so there's also a thermal stability safety portion of batteries that need to be considered and are being looked into. So in the comparison chart, we looked at lead acid, lithium ion, 5 different types of lithium ion batteries, and the liquid electrolyte flow battery. And this comparison is in the resource, it's on the link there, and it's in the Resilient Solar PV System fact sheet, the one we did first year. Next slide. So this is just the example table that we looked at all these different types of batteries and their usage, how large they are, watt hours per kilogram, which is energy density, and how many life cycles they have, and efficiency, and some of the advantages and disadvantages. So this is a good reference when trying to decide which batteries to incorporate into a resilient PV system. And then in the next slide, when we're trying to decide what components to put into a system, it depends really on what you want your system to be used for. If it's just for emergency backup, then it's just intended to operate occasionally, and the batteries are used when the grid goes down. Then they'll be used to help power your critical loads. In demand management, this system is intended for like peak shaving on your demand or shifting your peak. So you use the batteries more often. And so in this situation, you would need batteries that have a high number of life cycles and deep cycle consideration. And battery bank has to be sufficiently large or large enough to cover your demand so that you can actually provide power during the time of your peak demand and shift that. So this would take batteries that, like I say, are of a high number of life cycles. If you want to use the batteries for like grid services, this is where you provide ancillary services like frequency and voltage regulation. Then you should use batteries capable of quick response. So you'd have to be able to have software that communicates with your utility and ties in to having quick response so they can use your batteries for frequency and voltage regulation. I'd like to then talk a little bit about configuration of systems. On the slide here is a typical, this is just a typical PV grid-tied system that we assumed we start with a PV array. Then you have the grid-tied inverter that feeds your non-critical and main distribution system. But as this shows, when the utility goes down, the grid-tied system also, that inverter disconnects. In system configuration, we look at tying either to the DC side or the AC side. And so we have a DC coupling and an AC coupling. On the next slide, we talk about that. We can look at how the DC coupled system integrates a battery system into your existing array. So if you have a PV array in a DC system, coupled system, you would have to remove the grid-tied inverter and tie everything to the DC side with the charge controller and then the battery bank. And then you would add a dual functioning inverter to be able to tie to your critical loads the battery and the PV, but then the utility is also able to charge through that dual function inverter the batteries. And if you toggle during the off-grid mode when you're islanded, you can have a backup generator so that you have that toggle automatic transfer switch goes down to the generator that would feed the critical load and could be used also to charge the batteries through that dual function inverter. This is a nice system in that it's more efficient and you have one inverter and you use the PV to charge the batteries directly, and there's less communication complications for dispatching. And then, but it's if you already have a system, like with a grid tied, it often takes more changes in wiring to redo this. This configuration is really good if you're just putting in PV system and batteries at the same time. It's higher efficiency in this way. Next slide. In the next slide, we look at the AC coupled system where you keep the grid-tied inverter intact, and then you add the battery bank and the AC, DC, and dual and functioning inverter all tied to the backup AC distribution center, and therefore you can have the utility will be charging the batteries, and then when the utility goes down, you'd either have a backup generator or the PV system all charging the batteries. In this system, it's a little less efficient because you have to go through an inverter from the PV back, it converts it to AC, and then you have to go back through an AC to DC to charge the batteries when you're in off-grid mode. So it's slightly less efficient, but it's often more acceptable in like in a third-party situation where you already have an inverter and an ownership. Then you can just add another dual functioning inverter. But when you do add another inverter, like a dual functioning inverter, to the system and the batteries, you have to make sure they're compatible with the inverter you have in place. So this is like the AC coupled inverter configuration. And then the next slide is just a table of what we just talked about, some of the advantages and disadvantages of the two different types of configuration. And so for, like I said, with the DC coupled, you have a fewer power conversions, and but it's more complex electrical configuration to reconfigure it oftentimes if you've already had a grid-tied inverter in there. And the AC coupling may be preferable for a existing third-party owned solar system. But the AC coupling, it increases more challenges because of the communication between the two inverters. So with that, I'll transfer the slides over to Lars, who will talk about implementing these systems and project development.
Thanks, Kari. Yeah, that was a great overview of the different system configurations, and gives the audience an idea of the different components that are involved with the systems, and how those different components come together. So what I'm going to jump into is considerations for actually building these systems and developing projects. So there are three basic categories that I wanted to walk through. First, pre-project scoping. Second, system design, and then third, implementing the systems or implementation. Just to give everyone an idea of the sorts of things to think about as a project like this is developed. So the first category is pre-project scoping. And essentially what we want to ask here is, what's the goal of the project? Is the goal resiliency? Is it a certain amount of resiliency, a certain number of days? Is the goal of the project purely economics, or trying to get a return on investment for the system? these are the types of questions that have to be asked early in the project. And also prioritizing these objectives. So, it's possible to build a system that has multiple objectives, whether, there might be an economic driver in there, but also there's a resiliency driver. So, kind of prioritizing these objectives and figuring out, what's priority one, then what's the second tier priority, things like that. And then also, when you're scoping out a project like this, you want to identify where the revenue streams are. Because if the project, if the project is going to be built, you want to find out the best ways that it can return some of that that value to the end user. So these are the types of questions that we want to ask. And in terms of objectives, typically these fit into 3 different bins. Either emergency power, so providing resiliency to the facility in the event of a grid outage, demand management, or you could also call this peak shaving, just reducing the demand at a facility, which typically that's an economic driver behind demand management, or grid services, providing ancillary services to the grid like voltage regulation, those types of things. So after you've established sort of the pre-project objectives, the next consideration is system design. And for system design, these are the types of things that you want to think about that are specific to the site. So, the system ultimately will have to be bounded by whatever site constraints exist. And, I put a picture here up on the slide that shows a fire station that was evaluated for solar plus storage. And as you can see here, there's not a ton of space to site the system. So, those are the types of site constraints that need to be considered early in the project. So, things like physical space for the equipment, where can the equipment be located, how far is that from the mechanical room, those types of things. Also, regulatory considerations. So, how are the systems going to be permitted, and what sort of zoning restrictions are there? Currently in New York City, it's hard to get lithium-ion permitted inside of buildings. So so that's one consideration that would need to take place inside of New York City. And then also things like the interconnection agreement. So initiating that conversation with the utility and figuring out exactly what what sort of forms need to be filled out. How does the interconnection process happen? What are the different steps? These are all important things to consider. And then also component control. So Kari touched on this a little bit, but what are the different components in the system going to be compatible? If there's an existing solar array and you're trying to retrofit storage on it, you need to make sure that those systems are going to be able to interact with each other and are going to be able to communicate so that the system operates smoothly. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention was the investment tax credit. So as things currently are, and this may be changing here in the near future, but as things currently stand, batteries must be integral to this operation of the system in order to qualify for that investment tax credit. So it has to be demonstrated to the IRS that this system is integral, that the storage and the batteries are integral to the operation of the system. And also, in order to qualify for the investment tax credit, the batteries must be charged 75% of the time or greater in order to qualify. And so there's also a controls implication there, that in order for the system to be charged 75% of the time by renewable energy, the inverter is going to have to be able to communicate with the charge controller on the batteries. So these are all kind of really important things to think about when the system is being designed. Also, if the system is intended to be used for resiliency, sizing of the batteries and the critical load are going to be very important. And I put up some examples of critical loads, some examples of critical loads and then potentially non-critical loads. But these are the types of things that should be fleshed out as the project is being developed. And this also goes back to the objectives of the project. Maybe refrigeration is a really high priority for the facility, or that in some cases could be a non-critical load if the primary objective is just to keep the lights on and maybe keep a couple of computers on. But going through these different critical loads, figuring out what's critical, what's not critical, and then once you've nailed down that list, calculating based on those critical and non-critical loads, what size requirement is the battery going to have. And we've laid out a really simple equation here to calculate what battery capacity would be required for different system configurations. And the equation is just critical load times runtime gives you the rated battery capacity. So a really simple example here is if a site has 5 overhead lights, each one of the lights is 300 watts, and the lights need to be run overnight, you can take those 3 numbers, multiply them out, 5 times 0.3 kW per fixture times 12 hours gives you 18 kilowatt hours of battery storage required. So this starts to give you an idea of what sort of capacity requirements are going to be needed at the site. And there are more sophisticated ways of calculating this rated battery capacity. For instance, you could run a simulation in Homer Energy and run it over the course of the year with different load profiles and different solar resource, things like that. But kind of a back of the envelope calculation, you can get pretty close to whatever your capacity requirement is going to be. And the final step in the process is implementation. And once all the objectives are laid out and the system's been designed, you've got kind of your system constraints laid out, then the next step is actually to build it. So there are a couple of things to think about here. Number one, financing. Is this going to be a system that's third-party financed, where a developer comes in and pays for the system and then you pay them back over time? Or is it going to be a direct ownership model where the system is paid for just out of pocket, or I guess up front, and then all the benefits come back to the site? So those are decisions that just depend on what sort of capital is available, and then also what sort of third-party financing options are available in that particular location and in that utility territory. If the system is being done as a retrofit, it's very important to consider warranties. If you have an existing solar array and an existing inverter, you want to make sure that you're going to get the full warranty out of those systems, even if there's a battery system that's added to the mix. And typically, it's as simple as looking in the owner's manual, or putting a call into the equipment manufacturers. But it's definitely something that's worth thinking about. And and then in terms of actually putting the project out to bid or putting together a request for proposal, we put some example language in the document. And there should be links here in the presentation to where you can find the document. But attachment A has some kind of general work specification language, and it has to be customized to each site. So there are site characteristics that need to be added to the language, but it gives you kind of a groundwork for the types of things that will help you to specify a project and get a project that's going to satisfy all the requirements and all of the objectives. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention was selecting a contractor, because this is very, very important. Selecting a contractor that has technology experience is going to make sure that the project is successful. If they've done it successfully in the past, they should be able to do it successfully in the future. So, ask for other projects that they've done that have been successful. Call some project owners that the developer has worked with. These just kind of do some homework on your contractor, because they're going to be your partner through the entire process. So that wraps up the project development checklist, and now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about storage ready. Erica mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but I wanted to go a little bit more detail and just talk about what storage ready is and why it's important. So storage ready is this concept of building a PV system now that allows for a plug-and-play storage, or I guess storage should be added later at a later date, and have it just be able to plug in and work effectively. So there are many reasons why storage might not be implemented initially. Whether it's possible that there might not be incentives available for storage. There might be a new technology that's coming down the pipeline, or it could be possible that in the utility territory that the site is located, there's no revenue streams available to the system. So, even though there may be reasons not to do storage up front, it's still very important that the system is able to accommodate storage at a later date or in the future. And the main things that you want to avoid by making a system storage ready is you want to be able to avoid replacing equipment, so things like inverters, switches. You want to avoid having to do rewiring of the system. You want to avoid having to redesign all the components of the system, and essentially make it more difficult to add energy storage to a system in the future. And a few components. So this diagram here shows an example of a system that was designed to be storage ready, and kind of the idea here was the entire system is laid out so that you can see what the end state of the system looks like, and then only the components that are critical to the solar array are constructed initially, and then everything that would enable the storage to function is added later. So the battery bank, the DC disconnect, the dual function inverter, and then your AC disconnect. None of that stuff is built in sort of phase one of the project. But the way that the system is configured, it'll be really easy at a later date to come in and add all of these components into the system, and you'll have this plug-and-play functionality where you can just plug the components in. You'll have to probably reprogram the inverters, and then the system will function, and it'll give resiliency to the site. And the main components here that are added are the automatic transfer switch, some wiring. There would have to be some space in the mechanical room in order for the battery bank and the additional inverter be functionally sited, and then also a critical loads panel. So that's labeled here as the backup AC distribution center to critical AC loads. So I guess what's the driver for doing storage ready? Well, the bottom line is you want to be able to save time and save money by doing solar ready, so that at the time that the battery system will be implemented, it doesn't require this tremendously heavy lift and this large cost in order to integrate that system. And we ran some numbers on how much solar ready potentially would cost, and this is a residential example, so it's not going to be applicable to all projects, but gives you an idea of the cost magnitudes that we're considering here. But typically you can expect doing a system storage ready to add between 12 and 17% of the project cost. So in this residential example, we're talking about $2,000 to $3,000. But if a system is designed solar ready, it has the potential to save a tremendous amount of money on the back end when those batteries are integrated. So again, we're looking at something between 18 and 17 and 27% of the overall project cost, which in this residential example equates to between $3,000 and $4,500. So these prices will scale, as system sizes get larger, but those are kind of the magnitudes that we're looking at. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I think we have some time for questions here, but I wanted to point you to a couple of resources before we jump into questions, the full report that we've been talking about during this webinar can be found at the New York Solar Map, which is newyorksolarmap.com/resources/reports, and it's listed under there as a resiliency retrofit fact sheet. And also you can stay up to date with what we're doing here at Sustainable CUNY with the New York Solar Smart newsletter. If you go to the website, you can sign up there, and then once a month you'll get a letter that talks about some of the stuff that we're working on. And then contact information for Erica, Kari, and I is listed here with our email addresses. If there are questions that you don't get answered during the Q&A, feel free to reach out to us.
Great. Thanks, Lars, and thanks, Erica and Kari. This is a great presentation, and I urge everyone that is interested in learning more about this to go check out their resources, or anyone that's interested in resilient solar and storage. They have a great bunch of resources there, and all the information presented in their presentation is in there. And also, for those of you that have asked, we will be providing, the slides will be made available to everyone. We'll send out an email when those will be ready, and there'll also be a recording of the webinar. So if you want to share with others or review again yourself, that will be available, and we'll send around a link to that. So with that, I'd like to get to some questions that have been coming in. We've had quite a few questions, so we'll get to the ones that we can get to. We may need to have a little extra time at the end for those of you who can stick around. Maybe a few minutes to answer some of these. So then jump right in. First question, just interest in what type or what size system do you generally see for the storage to retrofit an existing residential solar array? I know that's not probably a one-off answer, but maybe you can give us an idea of a range of the type of system sizes for residential solar and storage.
Sure. So what we see at the residential level is usually between 5 to 25 kilowatt hours. I'd say 5 to 7 kilowatt hour system is pretty typical, but for larger homes that want to back up more loads, then up to 25 kilowatt hours might be sort of average.
Great. Question on inverters and functionality of dual inverters. Can the conversion from AC to DC and DC to AC, can that happen simultaneously, where you're doing conversions from one to the other and the other back at the same time, or can they only do one at a time?
This is Kari, and there's a lot of different inverters out there, and so they'd have to check with the manufacturers for sure, but generally I think it's considered one at a time. You can invert or then convert and charge the batteries.
Gotcha. Great. Also a question on the functionality of the battery system and the different things that it can provide, such as backup power, demand management, and the grid services, grid resilience. Can batteries do all three of those functions, or are you limited?
Sure. Feel free to jump in, Lars and Kari. So theoretically, yes, you could design a system that could supply all those needs and other objectives if you were to come up with them. But what we hear from project developers that we work with through the DG Hub is that it can be pretty difficult to satisfy all these different levels. So, for example, in New York City, there's a pretty large, or New York State rather, with the NY ISO, there's a pretty large threshold in order to satisfy ancillary service requirements. So if you want to provide voltage or frequency regulation, you need, I think it's 1 megawatt of capacity. So if you wanted to also tackle peak demand at a facility level, you might not necessarily have a system of that size. So I think in practice it's difficult to design systems that can achieve all three objectives, and it also just depends on the market that you're in. So I mentioned New York as an example where ancillary services are not driving our storage market. It's much more tackling your peak demand charges as well as facilities that are interested in resiliency. But we know in PJM territory, ancillary services are more driving that market, and they probably also are looking at resiliency as well. So you might see some of those different revenue streams stacked there.
Yeah,
and
I would add one.
I know that things like even in New York, there's the Brooklyn Queens demand management project that's currently underway right now, and I know that systems can be designed to participate and provide that demand capacity to the utility and provide peak demand reduction for the facility and be configured for resiliency in times when the grid is down. So it certainly, like Erica said, it certainly is possible, but finding that kind of sweet spot where you can provide all of the different services can be sometimes challenging, even finding the right battery technology to do all of them. I'm sorry, Lars, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, kind of more to your point. I think that the important thing is prioritizing the functions. So, you know, if you're participating for multiple different functions, you know, assigning a priority to one over maybe one of the others, you know, is how you could sort of remedy that situation. So, you know, priority one might be peak shaving, priority two might be demand response, and then priority three might be ancillary services. Because, yeah, you could find yourself in a situation where, you know, you participate in demand response, and then, you know, your building is peaking, so you really need a full battery to be able to, you know, keep that peak down for the month. But your battery is dead, so then, you know, you set your peak for that month, and it sort of throws off your revenue stream. So, you know, I think with a well-designed control system and then some prioritization, it's possible to participate in all those things.
So I think this is an area that you've explored, and it's a good question about how a retrofit like this would affect net metering. Would adding a battery create problems for net metering? Are there specific requirements by the utility in order to be able to continue your solar net metering while having a battery installed?
Yeah, so actually that's a really good question, and we do address that question in the text of the document. So there, you know, we worked with the utilities in New York State to lay out, you know, exactly when you're able to do net metering with a battery and when you're not. So there's some specific rules, and, you know, the best way to answer that question is, you know, to work with the utility, and typically they'll have some, you know, some specific instances where you can net meter with a battery and where you can't. So yeah, I would say that you know, read through the text in the document and also work with the utility.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if this question does happen to come from New York State, if you're working on a specific project, we did contact the utilities here, and they kind of agreed to these there are basically 4 different scenarios, and it comes down to how the systems are configured for charging, and, you know, they're just trying to avoid energy arbitrage. So as Lars said, you can find that in the document, but it comes down to whether or not how they're configured behind either the same or different meters, if the storage is able to discharge directly into the grid, and if it's being charged by the grid, if the battery is being charged by the grid or the solar. So I think it's a little maybe too much to get into in the few minutes we have left, but we're happy to walk through those New York specific configurations if you're interested offline.
Great. A couple more technical related questions. We'll see about these. In the DC coupled systems, are those configurations common, or do you see those with multiple string inverter topologies, or would those have to be designed with an AC inverter configuration?
So the one thing I will say about the DC configuration is it's the DC coupled configuration is more common as an off-grid system. So you know, historically, any off-grid systems have been DC coupled, batteries coupled directly to the solar. Solar charges the batteries, and then when there's a load on the system, you know, from whatever site, then, you know, it just goes through one conversion. So I would say that what we have experienced just in interviews with installers and talking to people from industry is that they prefer doing AC coupled systems. And AC coupled systems, it seems like, are also preferred for systems that are done as retrofits. And I think the reason is because you can, in a retrofit situation, you can do an AC coupled battery system without really having to reconfigure much of the existing equipment with the PV system. So yeah, I guess I think that answers the question of which ones are more common. But we have seen installers that do DC coupled systems, and typically most systems that are done without back inverters are still done as DC coupled.
And I think, Seth, this is Kari. I think a lot of times the question came up, especially with systems that use microinverters, which are the ones that are the small inverters tied to each of the PV panels. And people are wondering, can these incorporate battery systems? And that's, this whole idea of AC coupled allows for microinverters to be AC coupled into a battery system.
Yeah, great. Another question about the dual function inverters, the dual function. If you do have an existing system that has a grid-tied inverter and you replace that with a dual function inverter, can a lot of the rewiring be avoided if you don't have to do additional work to isolate critical loads and that sort of thing? Can the grid-tied rewiring be reused for replacement with a dual function inverter?
Yes, go ahead. Maybe Lars, you've talked to it.
Sure. Yeah, I guess one thing I will say about rewiring is a very site-specific thing, I guess. So there are so many different ways or I guess so many different site characteristics that can affect how much wiring is needed, and then in the case of a energy storage retrofit, how much rewiring is needed. So I would say the amount of cost and effort that goes into rewiring is more a function of those site characteristics than it is of an AC versus DC coupled system. But yeah, Kari, do you want to add anything to that, or did you have another perspective to add?
No, I think that you're correct that there are some new inverters coming out, so that if you do already have your critical loads wired separately, and you can just switch out with these dual inverters that are chargers, battery chargers. I think that they're coming up with a lot of new systems that can just easily do that without a lot of rewiring if you've already got the critical load out.
Great. We've had a few questions about the ITC and how that works. I'm going to field those. Basically, there was a question about how do you show that a battery system is integral, and that's really just showing that the battery system is tied to the solar system and is charged from the solar system. Now, as far as the requirement of the 75% cliff rule, where it has to be charged from solar 75% of the time, there are good questions about how do you prove that. A lot of systems may not have the functionality built in with them. There are software platforms that will track that. I know there's a system, there's a management software by a company called Jelly. I know that they do track where the charging source is, and that can be used for auditing purposes. For a lot of smaller systems, it can be an added expense that makes it difficult. There are some more leniency from what I understand from tax professionals with smaller systems, residential size systems, that the restrictions aren't quite as stringent there. Also, another question about the storage ready and and doing a retrofit later, is that still ITC eligible? So definitely the initial solar system is ITC eligible, and from what I've learned talking to tax professionals, adding storage in later on, again assuming that it's charged primarily from solar, should also be eligible for the ITC, but I would seek the advice of a tax professional before going ahead with the project. But from what I understand, that is the case.
Seth, could I throw one more thing in there?
Sure thing.
I think that, one of the key, I think that documentation is key to proving that the system is integral, and also proving, the 75% charging from the renewable energy. And, so if when the system's being designed and sort of documented and, submitted for interconnection and all of these different things, making sure that somewhere in the design, the engineer says this system, this battery system is integral to the solar array, for these reasons, or, if they say this system is charging 75% of the time from renewables, because this control is set this way, and that ensures that it's only charged from the solar, not the grid. Those types of things kind of, that can be pulled out, say, during a tax audit, that were done at the time of system implementation, are going to hold a lot more weight than something that's, thrown together, as the tax auditors are knocking at your door. So that's one thing to consider is, if you're taking that ITC, make sure that it's documented in there. Yes, it's integral, and yes, it's charging 75% of the time or more from the renewables.
Great. So it should be easy to address. What's the actual function of the automatic transfer switch?
So I can take a crack at that, and then Kari might want to add something. Okay. But the automatic transfer switch basically switches from grid power over to off-grid mode. And the reason for that is the system has to be completely disconnected from the utility grid in order to operate in off-grid mode. And that's a requirement through IEEE, because basically, if your system is operating and the grid is dead, there's the potential that energy could end up back on the grid, and that poses a safety risk to utility line workers. So what the automatic transfer switch does is it cuts that connection with the utility, and it isolates all of the equipment on the customer side of the meter. So the solar, the storage, and then whatever circuits are on that site. And the term automatic means that it does that without you having to physically go out there and flip the switch. So when it senses the grid drop, it automatically transfers the system into off-grid mode or island mode.
You could have a manual switch.
You could also have a manual switch, but yeah, then if the grid dropped, you'd have to physically walk out there, throw the switch, and it would operate the same way then.
Right.
So in a similar vein of questions, in your research, did you see any systems that didn't actually have critical loads isolated on a subpanel, where it was done more as a switching off the non-critical loads to isolate the loads just by basically turning off non-essential loads, instead of going through the rewiring to put in a critical load subpanel?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could do that. You could, just like you don't necessarily need an automatic transfer switch, you could have a manual transfer switch. You could also just go out to, the panel, and, this obviously depends on sort of the scale of the system and the scale of the site, but say in a residential type system, you could just go to the breaker and you could shut off the circuits that were non-essential. Where that gets tricky is if there are mixed circuits. So say you have a breaker that has, your fridge, your AC unit, and 2 lights on it. If you kill that one, you're going to kill some of your lights, and you're going to kill your fridge. when you might have only wanted to kill the AC. So there are ways that you can do it that way. It's just not quite as automatic. It takes somebody that knows how to do the switching, and then also it takes circuits that are laid out in a way that you can cut the critical or the non-critical ones while keeping the critical circuits energized.
But you also, when you go to design your system, you need to understand what kind of load your batteries and the whole system is going to be supplying. So usually, like if there is a diesel generator, a backup generator already in a system, it's got that critical load panel that it feeds. But for residential, you have to be careful that you make sure that you don't overload your system by not turning some of the stuff off.
Great. So it looks like we're pretty well out of time. We didn't get to all the questions, but we did get to a lot of them. And anyone that still has a remaining question, the contact information for all our presenters is up here today. Please reach out to them, or you can reach out to us at Clean Energy Group, and we can connect you with them directly. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Sam just for any last thoughts or announcements that she might have.
Thanks, Seth.
Thanks, Seth. So we do have several more webinars coming up this month related to resilient power, and you can find details about all of those on our website at resilientpower.org.